All right, take two, and welcome to another episode of the Quadruple D. Harvard University has filed a federal lawsuit in Boston challenging a Trump executive power play that slashed roughly $2.6 billion dollars in federal research funding. The university argues this isn't a mere budget tweak, it's political retaliation, an effort led by the administration to micromanage academic freedom, governance, and the ideological makeup of elite institutions. During the hearing, Harvard attorney Stephen Lehotsky framed the case starkly. By pulling the funding, the government is attempting to control Harvard's inner workings. He warned that without reversal, extensive research programs from cancer to AI could collapse, careers would be derailed, and labs shuttered. The judicial spotlight fell on Judge Allison Burroughs, appointed originally by Obama, who grilled the DOJ's lawyer Michael Velchick over what evidence exists that Harvard research is anti Semitic, which is the flimsy and laughable claim that is being used against Harvard, because some students are protesting the genocidal policies of Benjamin Netanyahu. That means the entire university must be anti-Semitic or something like that. The message here is if you oppose sending weapons to this other country that is slaughtering people and starving them to death, well, we're gonna punish you for it. So Judge Burroughs emphasized the lack of documentation, formal procedures, or substantive proof tying anti-Semitism to the funding freeze. She also argued the government had provided no documentation and no procedure to suss out whether Harvard administrators, quote, have taken enough steps or haven't to combat anti Semitism. So they're being deliberately vague on this so they can just claim the power for themselves without any strings attached. So Donald Trump can attack any university or presumably any other institution that he wants with no sort of strings attached to it, no restrictions on his power. So for Trump and his allies, this is cast as a crackdown on liberal bias, quote unquote, under the guise of fighting campus anti Semitism, especially criticism of Israel after October 7th, 2023. But critics, including myself, and including Harvard and numerous academic associations, argue it weaponizes anti Semitism laws to suppress protest, critical thought, and autonomy, and to reduce criticism of another country's authoritarian and genocidal leader, who again has a policy of deliberately starving people to death. And that includes the innocent, along with anybody who might be allegedly guilty of something. Just group punishment. It's like, imagine if some other country successfully did this to the United States based on real or alleged crimes that we have committed, that our government has committed. Now, would you be justifying that? Would you be like, oh, that's a good thing. I'm glad I'm starving to death because of something my government did. No, you'd be like, well, that wasn't me who did that. Well, you might be like that anyway. Um, but I think most of you out there are going to understand my point. The population in general is not necessarily, especially not wholly, responsible for what its government does. In parallel to what's going on here in Harvard, the administration has pursued visa revocations, ICE detentions, and mass probes into pro Palestinian activism on campus, targeting non citizens like Mahmoud Khalil at, I believe, Columbia University, and Rumesia Ozturk at, I believe, Tufts University. And the threats are looming pretty much everywhere, as far as the attacks on not just students but immigrants in general. They're talking about denaturalizing anyone they want, just based on a whim. It's a Tuesday. I'm going to remove citizenship from all people from this country, you know, and just like the shifting of the weather, they can just randomly decide, even if you came here legally, they'll be like, I, I don't think that's legal anymore. We're going to revoke your standing and get the hell out of here just because you're, of a different background that we don't happen to like. So yeah, that's going on right now, and it's part of the strategy. This Harvard thing is part of the strategy that stems from Executive Order 14188 from January of 2025 this year, which mobilizes federal agencies to monitor, deport, or imprison students involved in quote unquote anti Israel protest, effectively criminalizing speech and dissent against Netanyahu, whose policies have killed 100,000 plus people and again deliberately starved the general Palestinian population. So, this is a textbook case of state repression masquerading as a moral crusade. The real agenda is authoritarian, punish universities for tolerating dissent, enforce ideological conformity, and expand centralized federal control over education. So keep in mind, this is the same political party that for so long has claimed to stand against federal overreach. You know, states' rights, states' rights. Well, here they want to micromanage, the universities in every place, right? So, adding insult to injury, this political crackdown is riddled with hypocrisy. Amid Trump's aggressive stance on alleged, or in some cases perhaps real, campus anti Semitism, his administration has refused to designate domestic terror groups like the KKK or white supremacist networks as terrorist organizations, or even criticize them as anti Semitic. You would think that with the history of these groups being anti Semitic, you would at least be able to call them out for it, in the same breath that you're demonizing student protesters. And this is despite their obvious history of violence and terror. And it's not that they just have terror fantasies, they have a history of actually committing terrorist acts against people that they don't like. These groups like the KKK and neo Nazi organizations. So, ironically, the first white supremacist terrorist label under Trump's watch went not to these homegrown groups, but to the Russian imperial movement overseas in April 2020. Ironically, again, that happened under the first Trump administration, so we can oddly give a slight amount of credit there, perhaps. But why have we not called the KKK terrorists or various neo-Nazi organizations? It's very strange. So, meanwhile, Trump vowed to brand Antifa a terrorist group, even though Antifa does not really exist as a real organization, at least as a formal organization. And he yet remains silent on the KKK's decades of murders and terrorism. So that's naked ideological bias, demonize left leaning or anti Israel dissent, dodge long standing far right terror threats as an issue. Moreover, Trump attacked students critical of Israel by pulling funding and threatening deportation, yet did not apply similar scrutiny to organizations with documented terror records. this is ideological enforcement and not justice. So the bottom line here is that Harvard's suit isn't just about money, it's a test of academic freedom and resistance to authoritarian overreach. Meanwhile, Trump's playbook exposes hypocrisy, suppressing critical dissent, arming federal power against students, and ignoring homegrown terror groups to demonize wicked foreigners, you know, because they must all be wicked foreigners. If they're from a background that Trump and his type don't like. So, all right, on to the next segment of the show. This is what I call the peripheral poop head of the week, and this time it's Vincent Kennedy McMahon, more commonly known as Vince McMahon. And curiously, Vince's ex wife is the current United States Secretary of Education, so it kind of ties into the education theme here a little bit. And Vince Kennedy McMahon was born on August 24th, 1945. He is an American businessman best known for turning his family owned regional wrestling company into the global behemoth now known as WWE. Now, when I was a kid, it was mostly known as WWF, but I think people might have confused it for the World Wildlife uh, something or other. I don't even remember what it's called. Is it Federation, maybe? So they changed the name for that reason or some other reason. But alongside his then wife Linda, he co-founded the WWF, or I think it might have been originally the WWWF, which became the dominant force in professional wrestling. As a critical observer, his consolidation of power and use of hush money tactics make a cage-worthy case study and also a cringe-worthy case study. And he went from commentator to corporate overlord, so it's one of those interesting stories. After earning a business degree from East Carolina University in 1968, McMahon began publicly in wrestling during the 1970s as a commentator. In 1982, he acquired the company from his father. I mean, it's another case of nepotism, very common, despite all these people saying that they believe in merit as the key way of attaining success. But no, quite often it's just that they inherit the money and the wealth from their parents or something like that. And they embarked on a consolidation campaign. McMahon and whoever was with him, presumably a legal team, he was buying out regional promotions across the US, creating WrestleMania, and eventually swallowing up WCW in 2001 and ECW in 2003, forming an entertainment monopoly. So there is that corporate trend happening in the United States of just having these powerful monopolies attain more and more uh, power and dominance as a sort of singular entity, an umbrella company. And the world of wrestling is no different. So he did develop an on-screen persona, Mr. McMahon, because he wanted to be on TV. And from 1997 onward, he personified the archetypal corporate tyrant, Mr. McMahon, a character who delighted in power displays and public firings. And gee, why does that sound kind of familiar? But anyway, he would famously growl, "You're fired," on, another catchphrase that kind of rings a bell. He even wrestled several matches, winning WWE and ECW titles somehow, and headlining major events like Royal Rumble. So just like Donald Trump was once gifted a black belt, that's right, you can look that up. It actually happened. Somebody gifted Donald Trump a black belt. And of course, we've also heard that Trump cheats at golf. Kid Rock has admitted that in a Rolling Stone interview, although Kid Rock really pathetically tried to act as if that's a positive character trait of Trump because he'll do anything to win, man, or whatever that stupid argument is. You know, Kid Rock is a human pile of garbage, and he does even make good music. Like I can't think of a single decent Kid Rock song. And oddly enough, there's some of you out there who are going to be saying, "Oh, you're just saying that because you disagree with his politics." But here's the kicker. I actually do like one or two Ted Nugent songs. I mean, I don't listen to them regularly or whatever, but I can at least admit that a few of his songs aren't that bad. They're listenable at least. Kid Rock, not so much. He's just cringe inducing. Well, I got a little bit distracted here, but the point is that these people are they're pathetic. They want attention, and in this case, Vince McMahon, he somehow won WWE titles, in these wrestling matches. You know, take one look at the guy and tell me you think he's like a really good wrestler, or that like he could take on one of these other professional wrestlers out there. Like, do you think he could take on Andre the Giant or something like that? Come on, Hulk Hogan, even. Even though I'm not a fan of Hulk Hogan, he probably actually had some real skills, and even though I'm sure he was injected with tons and tons of steroids over the years, he probably did have some actual skills in the ring. Roddy Piper is another one who I'm sure he actually had some skills, and he was in some good movies too. Oddly enough, like, well, at maybe just one good movie, They Live, and he played a good character in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. So even though yes, I'm not the biggest wrestling fan, there are some wrestlers that I don't hate that much. So that's you know it's not that I love wrestling, but Roddy Piper and Andre the Giant, I don't think I hate them. But anyway, moving on. Uh, McMahon ended up wrestling with scandal. Between 2006 and 2022, McMahon secretly paid at least $12 million to various women to suppress allegations of sexual assault. So, yet another one of these figures in Trump's orbit. I'm noticing a pattern. And when the board finally investigated in 2022 these undisclosed payments, including a $3 million hush deal with a former employee, emerged. And there was some fallout and financial penalties. In June of 2022, McMahon stepped down as CEO of WWE and chairman. A month later, he formally retired, only to return as executive chairman in January 2023, amid rumors of a sale to media giant Endeavor. So on January 10th, 2025, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission fined him over $1.7 million for hiding two settlement agreements, one for $3 million in 2019, another for $7.5 million in 2022, and misstating WWE's 2018 and 2021 earnings. He didn't admit wrongdoing, but paid a $400,000 civil penalty and reimbursed WWE approximately $1.33 million. And there have been some grave civil and criminal allegations against him. No big surprise on that one. In January 2024, former paralegal Janet Grant filed a lawsuit accusing McMahon, WWE, and exec John Laurinaitis of coercing her into sex and trafficking her to others, including allegedly defecating on her during a sexual encounter. Wow. Really, quite an allegation here. And though Grant paused her lawsuit in mid 2024 during a DOJ probe, but I keep on wanting to say DOG, but DOJ probe, authorities later allowed it to proceed. As of early 2025, it's active again with Laurinaitis reportedly cooperating with investigators. Meanwhile, a federal criminal investigation by the Southern District of New York, reportedly launched in 2024, remains open, though in early 2025, New York Post reported it might have been dropped. So I'm not normally a big fan of New York Post, but occasionally they do some halfway decent coverage, as if the broken clock rule is being applied. And there was an exit from TKO and a broader shakeup. McMahon served as executive chairman of TKO Group Holdings, the merged entity of WWE and UFC under Endeavor, after a $21.4 billion deal in April 2023. But within months of Grant's lawsuit, he resigned from TKO in January of 2024, pulled by pressure from sponsors and internal leadership shakeups. So, as of 2025, here's what I can say. There is the civil suit by Grant that continues. Laurinaitis is reportedly cooperating. The DOJ and criminal investigation status remains unclear. McMahon remains WWE's largest shareholder, but cut public ties. And, my critical take is that this is a pretty consistent pattern with monopoly building. And no, I don't mean the board game, of course. McMahon's WWE tactics exemplify how corporate owners absorb weaker rivals, destroying local worker run wrestling ecosystems, if you will. I mean, it sounds kind of corny to say it that way, but that's kind of true. Any sort of organic wrestling organization is going to have a harder time having success competing when these sorts of organizations dominate. So it's one of those things. And of course, there are the alleged abuses, is a alleged use of NDAs or non-disclosure agreements and sexual coercion. It shows how hierarchical environments enable exploitation and encourage silence when it comes to any sort of scandals or abuse, whatever you want to call them. And despite serious allegations, including trafficking, sexual violence, etc., the state reaction has been limited, a modest civil fine, and unclear criminal follow up. So the system kind of protects power in this case. It's like I said in the last episode, I'm surprised that there is any accountability in these things anymore. I I'm frankly not even sure why this happens, that some people are being held accountable. Obviously, it's still kind of a good thing that some people get held accountable for any misbehavior like this, but I'm just curious, like, why is it sometimes that things happen, that people get away with things, but other times they just look the other way, even when some crimes are so obvious that you almost have to make a real serious and protracted effort to not see the misbehavior. So how come we sometimes easily ignore things and other times there's actually some accountability? It's a little bit odd and jarring. So, the bottom line here is that Vince McMahon's career tracks a classic pattern. He went from commentator to covert corporate autocrat. His strategic consolidation of wrestling, on screen bullying, alleged abuses of power, hidden payouts, and continued evasion of robust legal consequences really shows how wealth and hierarchy can shield elites from, you know, actually paying for crimes the way that smaller crooks might pay for a crime. And this story confirms yet again that without radical structural change, power corrupts and the ruling class will stay intact. And now we're going to look at the fetid fever dream flashback of the week, which is the third segment of these episodes. And yes, as I said, as promised, it's Linda McMahon, his ex-wife. So usually these flashbacks go back at least a decade or so, but this time not so much. This is a little bit more of a recent flashback, I suppose. Linda McMahon, former CEO of WWE and a political figure, notably head of the or former head of the Small Business Administration under the first Trump administration, I believe. She has not been directly involved in any personal scandal that reached the level of criminal charges or a media firestorm, at least not that I have heard about. However, several controversies surround her due to her business and political activities. And oddly enough, this might be to the dismay of some, but I'm not going to even look at her ongoing career as, someone in charge of the education of this country. I'm actually going to look at what she did when she was involved in the world of wrestling. The WWE labor practices controversy is really a core issue of her history. So it's not going to be totally irrelevant. It will most certainly tie into how she behaves in her new job. So while CEO of WWE, Linda McMahon presided over a company that treated wrestlers as independent contractors, despite WWE exercising significant control over their schedules, appearances, and branding. So this classification conveniently denies wrestlers health benefits, retirement plans, and job security. It protects the WWE from liability for injuries or deaths. It also allows the company to fire talent at will and without severance. So it's all very convenient to the corporate people at the top who want all of the power. And of course, that all has scandalous aspects. How could it not? There are dozens of wrestlers who have died young and from drug-related issues, brain injuries, or yes, they may have offed themselves in some cases. I I'm not really familiar with the list of the people who have been seriously harmed by the wrestling industry, but I'm sure you can imagine that it's happened. I don't have a list in front of me, and from what I understand, it's often linked to the physically destructive demands of the job, and maybe some of these people, they're dealing with unique issues as well related to specific dynamics at these companies. So the WWE heavily promoted dangerous stunts and schedules, but provided no long-term health care. So that's something I guess not everybody probably knows about. They just tune in to enjoy the wrestling, and they probably don't think of some of the issues. And I guess not all of these wrestlers are as well paid as the top earners. So it would probably be more of an issue for the lesser known wrestlers or whatever. So despite these issues, Linda McMahon ran for office twice as a Republican Senate candidate, framing herself as a successful business leader. So this is less of an individual scandal and more a symptom of systemic capitalist exploitation. And it's, I gotta say it's exploitation masked as entertainment. The WWE monetized the performances of these people while offloading responsibility. McMahon's leadership exemplifies how these capitalist enterprises will externalize harm and internalize profit. Wrestlers bore all of the risk, and the WWE reaped more of the reward. So it's pretty much guaranteed that these wrestlers are not being paid as well as they could be. Now, again, I'm sure there are some people at the top who are really doing okay as far as the money goes, but it's probably not applying to everyone who is who has wrestled for these types of companies. And there's hierarchical control without accountability. The WWE dictated virtually every aspect of its talent's professional life, where to be, what to say, what to wear, without the reciprocal obligations that an employer would normally owe under fair labor practices. And this is authoritarianism masquerading as entrepreneurship. And it's political power reinforcing corporate abuse yet again. McMahon's appointment to these various positions in government, it shows that state power is being used to uphold corporate interests, really. And her role in government wasn't to challenge monopolies or support grassroots business, but to entrench the same corporate model that abused labor in the WWE. And of course, there's probably going to be a corporate takeover of education if these people have their way, a corporate and oddly theocratic takeover of the education system. So there's also the use of spectacle to distract people from structural violence, I guess, if you want to put it that way. The WWE created a hyper masculine, nationalistic, and often militaristic spectacle, to sort of brainwash the masses, if you will. That's one of the reasons I'm not the biggest wrestling fan because, well, I naturally tend to reject those types of, I don't know, displays. I think they're dumb, for lack of a better word. But, this served as ideological cover for labor abuses and helped normalize violence, exploitation, and dumb submission to authority, especially among working class fans who might emulate some of these wrestlers. They're for whatever reason they really like what they represent. The really conformist messaging of wrestling, it's just kind of, it makes it boring for me. And plus, knowing that there isn't really much actual sportsmanship involved in this stuff. It's more like a soap opera, oddly enough, with the characters. I mean, sure, you might have funny scenarios here and there. I'll admit that. Like wrestling might have a zany character, or maybe occasionally an impressive event where people do impressive things. But at the end of the day, it's actually kind of reinforcing, the hierarchical stuff about, like tough steroid injected men need to call all the shots and might makes right and all that kind of crap. So that's the reason I've never been the biggest wrestling fan or the biggest fan of GI Joe or the military or basically any system of authority that much. It might be the case that authority is necessary to some degree, but I'm not gonna like bask in its glory or something like that. I will grudgingly accept authority in certain scenarios, like when it comes to, well, like when you're a kid, you have parents. You generally listen to your parents, maybe not always, but generally. But you still don't give the parents unlimited say, as a society. If a parent is abusive or, just totally not there to take care of the child or whatever, just lets the child down and lets the community down and just as a total failure as an entity. Well, you might hold that parent accountable. You might treat them as if they are abusive in some way. And this the same thing is true of something like the WWE. If it's abusive to its employees, then you hold it accountable. And it's really true of any organization. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. If if something doesn't do what it says it's supposed to do, then that's one of the signs that it's not as legitimate as it could be. If it does more harm than good, that's another sign that it lacks legitimacy. And, if it lacks accountability, that also means it lacks legitimacy. So I better wrap this up or I could keep talking about it forever. But Linda McMahon's biggest scandal isn't a singular gotcha moment, it's her role in perpetuating systemic labor exploitation while using political power to whitewash it. So she's a textbook case of capitalist power hiding behind the American dream with macho imagery and all that stuff. And she's guilty of leveraging spectacle and political clout to extract value from others' suffering without accountability. So, on that uplifting note, have a nice day.